She had nothing. No name anyone here knew, no family waiting on her, no horse, no money worth counting. Just a worn canvas bag, a single silver coin warm from being held too long, and a body that had walked farther than it should have survived. The man at the door had a shotgun across his forearm and 6 sons standing behind him like a wall. "We don't take in strangers," he said. She didn't flinch, didn't beg, just looked him dead in the eye and said, "Then I'll sleep in your barn. I won't bother anybody." That was the moment everything changed. If this story already has you, stay with me until the end. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The cold came early that October in Harlan County, Montana. By the time the sun dropped behind the Bitterroot Ridgeline, the temperature had fallen 12 degrees in under an hour, and the wind off the northern flats had a mean streak that cut straight through wool like it wasn't there. Ranchers who'd lived in that valley their whole lives said it was going to be a hard winter, the kind that killed livestock and broke men who weren't already broken. Evelyn Mercer walked the last 4 miles of that road in boots that had worn through at the left heel 3 weeks ago. She didn't limp, or rather she'd stopped letting herself limp somewhere around mile 2, because limping felt like surrender, and she wasn't ready for that yet. She was 34 years old. She had sharp gray eyes that people sometimes mistook for coldness until they got close enough to see what was actually living behind them. Her coat was a man's coat, too large at the shoulders, the kind of garment you grab when everything else is gone, and practical is the only thing that matters anymore. She hadn't eaten since yesterday morning. The Ashcroft Ranch came into view just as the last light died, a cluster of dark shapes against a darker sky, smoke rising thin from a stone chimney. There were lights in the windows, warm amber rectangles that looked almost cruel from out on the road, where the cold was absolute. A large barn sat back and to the left, and even from the road she could see that the fence lines needed work, that one of the gateposts was leaning at an angle that would have driven a careful man crazy. She stopped at the end of the drive and just looked at it for a moment. She wasn't naive about what she was doing. She knew how it would appear. A lone woman, no wagon, no horse, no obvious explanation, showing up at a stranger's door in the dark. She'd already been turned away from 2 homesteads that day, one with decent enough manners about it, and one that hadn't bothered with manners at all. She had the single silver coin in her coat pocket, worn smooth on one face from the habit of rubbing it between her thumb and forefinger when she needed to think. She rubbed it now. Then she walked up the drive. She knocked twice, steady, not desperate. There was movement inside, voices, the sound of boots on floorboards, something being set down hard. The door opened and the light came out around a man who nearly filled the frame. Silas Ashcroft was 41, though he looked older in the way that outdoor work and loss will age a person from the inside out. He was broad through the chest, dark-haired going gray at the temples, with a jaw that looked like it had been quarried rather than grown. His eyes were the color of creek water in November. Not unfriendly, exactly, but guarded in a way that had been practiced so long it had become the natural expression of his face. He held a shotgun loosely across one forearm, not pointed at her, just present. Behind him, in the shallow light of the front room, she could make out figures. Boys. Several of them, various heights, all of them looking at her the way they might look at something unexpected that had appeared in the yard. Cautious, uncertain, not quite ready to decide what it was. "Help you?" Silas said. "My name is Evelyn Mercer," she said. "I've been walking since Caldwell Creek. I'm not carrying anything that could hurt you. I'm not carrying much of anything at all." She paused. "I'm asking for a place to sleep. A corner of a room, a hayloft, whatever you can spare. I'll be gone by first light if that's what you want." There was a silence that lasted long enough to be uncomfortable. "We don't take in strangers," Silas said. She looked at him steadily. "Then I'll sleep in your barn. I won't bother anybody." Something shifted in his expression. Something small, difficult to name. He looked past her for a moment, at the darkness behind her, as if checking whether she was actually alone. She was. "Elias," he said, without turning around. One of the boys stepped forward. The eldest, she'd guess, somewhere around 19. Tall like his father, but lean in the way of someone who hasn't quite grown into his frame yet. He had his father's jaw and his mother's eyes, or so she'd learn later. Right now, he was just looking at her with naked suspicion. Check the barn, Silas said. Make sure she's got somewhere dry. Pa, I didn't ask for your opinion. Elias pressed his mouth flat and grabbed a lantern off the hook by the door. He pushed past her without looking at her, boots loud on the porch steps. Silas looked at her again. You eaten? Yesterday, she said. He stepped back from the door. Not quite an invitation, but not a refusal either. She walked in. Dodsan. The inside of the Ashcroft house was the kind of space that told you everything about the people living in it without them having to say a word. It was large enough. A long front room with a stone fireplace that probably hadn't been properly cleaned in months. A rough-hewn table with 8 chairs, 2 of which had cracked rungs that nobody had gotten around to fixing. There were dishes stacked on the sideboard, not dirty exactly, but not put away with any care either. A woman's curtains still hung in the windows, faded blue with small white stitching at the edges. They were the only soft thing in the room, and they looked out of place in the way that objects do when the person who chose them is no longer there. She counted 5 boys in the room, ranging from what looked like 8 years old up to Elias's age. They had arranged themselves in a loose semicircle without seeming to do it on purpose, just the instinctive formation of people who shared a space and didn't know how to act around something unfamiliar. The youngest one, round-faced, hair that hadn't been cut in too long, a front tooth still growing in, was staring at her with the unself-conscious directness that only very small children manage. "What's in the bag?" he said. "Tommy," Silas said, a warning in the word. "It's all right," Evelyn said. She set the bag on the floor and crouched down to his level, which made 2 of the older boys shift their weight. "Not much. A change of clothes, a tin cup, a photograph." She looked at the boy. "What's your name?" "Thomas Ashcroft," he said, with the gravity of someone who had been corrected about this recently. "But everybody calls me Tommy." "Hello, Tommy." He thought about this for a moment. "Are you going to stay here?" "Just tonight." "Oh." He seemed to take this seriously, turning it over. "Okay." One of the middle boys, Kate, dark eyes, a set to his shoulders that meant he'd been carrying something heavy for too long, made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "She's not staying anywhere," he said. "She's sleeping in the barn." "Caleb." Silas's voice was flat. "What?" "That's what you said." "I said enough." Caleb, who looked about 15 and had clearly decided that the world had given him specific and personal grievances, held his father's gaze for exactly 1 second too long before looking away. Evelyn stood up. She didn't look at Caleb with offense, which seemed to surprise him a little. "Is there somewhere I can wash up?" she asked Silas. She ate bread and cold meat at the end of the long table while the boys ate their actual supper around her, or mostly around her. Some of them had already eaten and drifted to other parts of the house. Silas sat at the head of the table and ate without conversation, the way a man eats when conversation has stopped being something he looks forward to. Evelyn didn't push. She didn't try to be charming or explain herself further. She ate what she was given, thanked him for it simply, and didn't overstay at the table. The barn, as it turned out, was dry and reasonably protected from the wind. Elias had laid a horse blanket over a clean section of straw without being asked to, which she noted and filed away. He didn't say anything when he showed her the space, just held the lantern up so she could see clearly, and set an extra candle on the edge of a post. "There's a latch on the inside," he said. Works fine." "Thank you, Elias." He looked at her sharply when she used his name. She hadn't been introduced to him, and they both knew it. "I heard your father say it," she said. He gave her one more look, flat and measuring, then left. She lay in the dark for a long time before she slept. Outside, the wind found every gap in the barn wall and came through in cold, thin threads. She pulled the horse blanket up and listened to the breathing of the animals nearby. The deep, slow, indifferent peace of horses in the night, and felt for the first time in she couldn't remember how long, that she was at least not in danger. Not comfort, not safety, exactly. Just the absence of immediate danger. It was enough to sleep on. She was up before dawn, not because she'd promised to be, though she had, but because she genuinely could not sleep past first light anymore. That was something that had happened to her over the past 2 years, a change in her body's relationship with darkness, as though some internal clock had been reset by necessity. She found the water pump behind the house and worked it quietly in the gray pre-dawn cold, washing her face and hands with the focus of someone who does it because it matters, not because anyone is watching. She retied her hair. She straightened her coat. Then she looked at the house. The porch boards needed attention. 2 of them were soft in the middle, and one near the door was pulling away from the joist underneath. The woodpile by the east wall was low and badly stacked, meaning half of it was already absorbing moisture from the ground. The kitchen garden, visible through the side gate, had been left to ruin. The beds hadn't been turned, and there were dead plants still upright in the rows, stiff and gray like small monuments. She wasn't cataloging these things with any agenda. She just noticed. She'd always noticed. She went back to the barn and found an axe. Silas came out at 6:30 to find her splitting wood. She'd been at it for 40 minutes. The pile she'd already cut was neater than what had been there before, properly stacked, elevated slightly off the ground on 2 horizontal pieces she'd found in the corner of the barn. She was working through a round of pine when she heard the porch door and looked up. He was standing there in his shirt and suspenders holding a coffee cup, looking at her the way people look at something they didn't account for. "You were supposed to be gone by first light," he said. "I know." She set down the axe. "I wanted to do something useful first. I can leave now, or I can keep going. Up to you." He looked at the woodpile. She could see him doing the math, how long it would have taken him, or one of the boys, to do what she'd done in 40 minutes. "You eat breakfast?" he asked. "Not yet." He was quiet for a moment, looking somewhere past her, at the middle distance. Then he said, "There's coffee," and went back inside. She picked the axe back up. The week that followed didn't have a clean shape to it. It wasn't a series of breakthroughs or a montage of goodwill gestures landing softly and changing everything. It was messier than that. She fixed the porch boards on the second day, working beside a 12-year-old named Henry, who handed her nails without being asked, and said almost nothing, which suited her fine. Henry was one of the silent ones, she understood. Not shy, exactly. Just someone who'd learned that words were sometimes more expensive than they were worth. "You've done this before," Henry said, watching her countersink a nail without it splitting the wood. "Some," she said. "Where?" She paused, just briefly. "Before I came here." He accepted this with the equanimity of someone who understood that before could be a complicated country. Caleb watched from the fence that afternoon, making no secret of the fact that he was watching. His expression was the expression of a boy who had decided she was a problem and was simply waiting for the proof to present itself. She didn't look at him too long or too directly. She'd met Caleb before, but not this specific boy, but this specific wound dressed in hostility. She understood what it was. She didn't try to win him over. She just kept working. The thing that surprised her, the thing she hadn't expected, was the house itself. It wasn't the mess, which was considerable. It was the way the mess wasn't random. It was the mess of people going through motions without purpose, keeping things barely functional but not living in the space, not inhabiting it. The woman's curtains in the window, a child's drawing still tacked to the wall of the hallway, curling at the corners. A rocking chair in the corner of the front room that no one sat in, positioned as though someone might sit in it someday when they were ready. She'd asked Tommy, who had decided she was interesting without worrying too much about what that meant, about the chair. "That was Mama's," he said simply. "Nobody sits in it." "How long ago did she pass?" Evelyn asked. He held up fingers, then thought about it. 14 months, he said. Pa said it like that, 14 months. 14 months. She'd noticed that Silas still sometimes set 8 places at the table before catching himself and removing one. That he paused outside his wife's old kitchen garden sometimes, just stood there, not moving, not looking at anything in particular. That he was a man doing an honest, exhausted job of raising 6 sons, while something essential in him was still sitting beside a grave somewhere, not quite able to leave. She knew that particular geography. On the 4th evening, she cooked supper for the first time. Not because anyone asked her to, but because she was there, and the oldest boys were out with the cattle, and Silas was patching fencing on the north end, and Tommy was sitting alone in the kitchen looking at a pot of water that had gone cold. "You trying to make supper?" she asked. "I was going to," he said. "I don't really know how." She took off her coat and hung it on the hook. "Move over," she said not unkindly. She made a beef stew from what was in the cellar. Nothing fancy, nothing complicated, but hot and proper. She let Tommy stir when he asked to, talked him through what she was doing and why without making it a lesson, just conversation. When Silas came in from the cold and smelled what was on the stove, he stopped in the doorway for a moment. Just stopped. Then he took his hat off, slow, and hung it up. "That's," he started. "Hungry work, fixing fences in this weather," she said. "Sit down." He sat down. Supper that night was different from the nights before. Not dramatically. Nobody made a speech. Nobody had a revelation. But the boys talked more than they had. Even Caleb, who had watched the meal being prepared with his default expression of skeptical observation, ate 2 bowls and said nothing negative. Small thing. She noticed it. After the dishes were washed, she washed, Henry dried, which seemed to be an arrangement he arrived at on his own. Silas found her on the porch. "How long you planning to stay?" he asked. The question wasn't unfriendly. It was the genuine question of a man trying to plan. She looked out at the dark line of the ridge. "I don't have a destination, if that's what you're asking. I've been moving for a while." She turned to look at him. "If I'm useful here, I'd like to stay and be useful. If you decide I'm not, or you just want me gone, I'll understand that too." He was quiet for a moment. The wind moved through the pine trees at the edge of the property, a sound like water. "You running from something?" he asked. "I was," she said. "I'm not sure I still am." It was more honest than most people would have been, and he seemed to know it. "There's a storage room off the kitchen," he said finally. "It's not much, but it's inside." She looked at him. "All right." He nodded once, the way he seemed to communicate most things, and went back inside. She stayed on the porch a moment longer. The cold was real and clean, and the stars over Montana in October were the kind of stars you could only see in a place where there were no competing lights. A whole sky of them, indifferent and enormous and strangely comforting, the way enormous and indifferent things sometimes are. She breathed in. She'd stopped somewhere. She didn't know yet if stopped was the same as found, but it was something. She went inside and latched the door behind her. The storage room off the kitchen was exactly what Silas had said it was. Not much. It measured roughly 8 by 10 feet, with a single small window set too high to see out of properly. A dirt floor that had been partially covered by old boards someone had laid down and never finished laying, and a smell of dried onions and dust that didn't go away no matter how many times she swept. There was no bed. There was a corn shuck mattress rolled up in the corner that had been used at some point by someone, and a wooden crate that could serve as a table if you weren't expecting too much from it. She set her canvas bag on the crate, unrolled the mattress, and lay down in her coat. She slept better than she had in months. That was the thing about very low expectations. They were surprisingly easy to meet. By the end of the second week, she had established a rhythm in the household, not by announcing it or asking permission, but by simply doing things consistently enough that they started to become expected. Coffee on the stove before the boys were up, the front room swept before breakfast, supper that was more than cold meat and bread. Small things, done without ceremony, that began to fill in the gaps where the house had been running on empty. Silas watched this happen with an expression she couldn't fully read. He wasn't a demonstrative man. She'd understood that immediately. He communicated in silences and small gestures and the occasional direct question that landed like a stone in still water. He didn't thank her often, but he noticed everything she did, and she knew he noticed because twice she'd done something slightly different from her usual routine and found him pausing in a doorway with a look of mild confusion, recalibrating. The boys were a more complicated matter. Elias, the eldest, maintained his early posture of civil distance. He was respectful in the way that people are when they've been raised right and don't want to be rude, but he didn't seek her out, didn't offer conversation, and had a habit of leaving a room shortly after she entered it. Not dramatically, not obviously, just quietly redirecting himself somewhere else. She didn't take it personally, or she tried not to. She understood that for Elias, she represented something difficult to categorize, not family, not hired help, not a threat exactly, but something that didn't fit any of the shapes he'd prepared for. Henry, the quiet 12-year-old, had become something like a shadow. Not in an intrusive way. He didn't talk much or demand anything. But he had a habit of appearing wherever she was working and making himself useful without being asked, handing her things before she reached for them, holding boards in place while she nailed them, carrying water when she was washing. She'd stopped being surprised by his presence and had started simply including him, the way you include weather in your plans. The other boys occupied a range between these two poles. There was Jonah, 16, who had a quick mind and a restless mouth and a tendency to ask questions that skipped politeness entirely and went straight to the point. Where'd you learn to fix a fence? And was your husband a rancher? And why'd you leave wherever you came from? Questions she answered as honestly as she could without giving more than she wanted to, which Jonah seemed to understand and respect in his own way. There was Seth, 13, who was still in the phase of grieving that looks like indifference, doing everything he was supposed to do with the flat, automatic performance of someone who has decided that feelings are a waste of energy. And there was Daniel, 10, who was simply angry at nothing specific and everything at once, and who had broken two things in the past week that Evelyn was reasonably sure he'd broken on purpose. And then there was Tommy. Tommy was 8 years old and had apparently decided, sometime around the end of the first week, that Evelyn was the most interesting development at the Ashcroft Ranch in recent memory, possibly ever. He had taken to sitting at the kitchen table while she worked, providing a running commentary on the household that was more candid and more useful than anything an adult would have told her. Elias used to laugh more, Tommy said one morning, watching her roll out dough for biscuits. Before Mama, he used to do this thing where he'd grab me and spin me around until I got dizzy. He doesn't do that anymore. People change when they lose someone, Evelyn said. Do they change back? She thought about that honestly. Sometimes, not all the way, but sometimes enough. Tommy considered this, then reached over and pressed his finger into the edge of the dough. She moved his hand without scolding him. Caleb cried at night for 3 months, Tommy said matter-of-factly. He doesn't know I know that. His room is next to mine. Then we should probably keep that between us, she said. Tommy nodded solemnly. The idea of being trusted with something seemed to sit well with him. It was Tommy, without intending to, who gave her the clearest picture of what the Ashcroft household had looked like before. Not from sentimentality, he was too young for that kind of curated nostalgia, but from simple, unvarnished memory. His mother had kept a proper kitchen garden. His mother had made his father sing at supper, badly, and made everyone laugh about it. His mother had known each boy's specific hurt and had known how to reach it without pushing. His mother had been, by Tommy's 8-year-old accounting, the thing that made the house make sense. Evelyn didn't try to be that. She was careful about that, careful in a way that took real effort, because it would have been easy and also wrong to step into that shape. She wasn't these boys' mother. She wasn't going to pretend to be. What she could be was present and useful and honest, and those were things she had to offer on their own terms. The trouble with Caleb came to a head on a Tuesday afternoon in the 3rd week. She'd been rehanging the kitchen door, which had been dragging on its lower hinge badly enough that it scraped a pale arc across the floorboards every time it opened. It was fussy work, getting the pin seated right, shimming the frame in 2 places, and she was most of the way through it when Caleb came in from outside and stopped. That's Elias's job, he said. Elias is out moving cattle, she said. The door needed to be done. He said he was going to do it. He can still do it if he wants. I'm just doing it now. Caleb came further into the kitchen and leaned against the table with his arms crossed, watching her work with an expression she recognized. It was the expression of someone looking for an argument and willing to be patient about finding one. You're not part of this family, he said. She didn't stop working. She set the hinge pin, tested the swing. Better. I know that, she said. Then why are you acting like you are? She looked at him then, not with anger, not with the placating expression of someone trying to manage him, just looked at him straight. I'm not acting like anything. I'm fixing a door. You cook our food. You fix our things. You're in our house. His voice had a crack in it that he was fighting to keep out. You're everywhere. She set down the screwdriver. She turned to face him fully, which he didn't seem to expect. You're right, she said. He blinked. What? You're right that I'm not family. And you're right that it's strange having someone you don't know moving through your house like this. She kept her voice level, not soft, not hard. You don't have to like it. You don't have to like me. But I'm not here to take anything from you, or from your brothers, or from your father. I'm here because I had nowhere else to go, and your father was decent enough to let me stay. That's all it is." Caleb stared at her. The muscles in his jaw were working. "My mother died," he said. The words came out ragged, stripped of the protective anger that had been wrapped around them. "And now some woman shows up and starts rearranging everything, and everyone's just supposed to be fine with it?" "No," she said. "No one said you had to be fine with it." The silence between them was not comfortable, but it was real. She didn't rush to fill it. Finally, Caleb pushed off the table and walked out of the kitchen. He didn't slam the door, which she thought said something. She picked up the screwdriver and finished tightening the last screw. When she told Silas about it that evening, she felt he should know because it concerned his son, and she wasn't in the habit of keeping things from the man who had let her sleep in his barn. He listened with his eyes on the middle distance and his coffee cup held in both hands. "He say anything to you before that?" Silas asked. "No, this was the first time it came to a head." Silas was quiet for a moment. "I'll talk to him." "You don't have to on my account," she said. "He's not wrong about any of it. He's just hurting." Silas looked at her with something she couldn't quite name. "Most people don't make that distinction," he said. "Most people are easier to deal with than Caleb," she said. "He's worth the extra effort." Something shifted in Silas's face, just slightly. He looked back at his coffee. She was learning that Silas Ashcroft was a man who felt things deeply and showed them reluctantly, and that the 2 or 3 seconds after something landed on him, before he rearranged his expression, were the only real window into what was happening inside. She didn't stare at those moments, but she noticed them. The gossip started in town around the same time. She heard about it first from Henry, who'd gone in with Elias to pick up feed and come back quiet, in a way that was different from his usual quiet. She let it sit for an afternoon before she asked him. "Somebody at the feed store said something?" she said. Henry looked up from the harness he was mending. He had the focused look of someone deciding whether to answer honestly. "Somebody's wife," he said. "She was talking to another woman. She didn't know I could hear." "What did she say?" He took a moment. "That you were probably running from the law, or that you were—" He stopped. "That you had your eyes on Pa's property and you'd found a clever way in." She absorbed this. "Is that what you think?" Henry looked at her directly, the way he sometimes did, clear-eyed and without artifice. "No," he said, and went back to the harness. She found out later that the woman doing the talking was named Margaret Langford, wife of Victor Langford, who owned the Harlan County Bank and a considerable portion of the valley's goodwill by way of loans and favors. Margaret Langford was the kind of woman who dressed her cruelty in concern, who spoke about other people in the tone of someone who wished things were different and couldn't help that they weren't. She was, by all observable evidence, extremely good at it. Evelyn had seen Victor Langford once, from a distance, on her second trip into town with Silas for supplies. A thick man, well-dressed for the frontier, with the particular confidence of someone who hadn't been told no in long enough that he'd stopped preparing for the possibility. He'd nodded at Silas from across the street, and Silas had nodded back, and neither of them had smiled. And that exchange had told her almost everything she needed to know about the relationship between those two men. "He hold paper on the ranch?" she'd asked Silas on the ride back. Silas's hands had tightened on the reins, just slightly. 18 months left on a 5-year loan, he said. "The rate fair?" A pause. "It was fair when we signed it. She'd let it go at that. It wasn't her business, not then. But the number sat in her memory like a pebble in a boot. Small and specific and impossible to ignore once you were aware of it. The rumors from Margaret Langford spread the way rumors do in small communities. Not all at once, but in the drip and seep of whispered conversations, a word adjusted here, an implication added there. By the 4th week, Silas was getting looks at the feed store. By the 5th week, one of his neighboring ranchers, a man named Pruitt, who'd been friendly with the Ashcrofts for years, found an excuse not to invite Silas to the monthly meeting of valley landowners, where water rights and grazing agreements were usually discussed. Silas said nothing to her about any of this. She found out from Tommy, who found out by being 8 years old and largely invisible to adults, having conversations they didn't want children to hear. "People are saying bad things about you," Tommy told her, with the directness of someone reporting a weather condition. "I know," she said. "Is it true?" She looked at him. "What do you think?" He took this seriously, the way he took most things. "I think you fixed our door, he said finally. "And you taught me how to make biscuits, and you listened when I told you about Mama." He shrugged in the particular way of a child who has made up his mind. People who do bad things don't usually do all that. "That's pretty good reasoning," she said. "Pa says you have to look at what people do, not what other people say about them." "Your pa's a smart man," Tommy nodded, entirely agreeable. "He is. He's also sad a lot, but I think that's getting a little better." She turned back to what she was doing and didn't answer that, but she held it. The thing about the Langfords, the thing she would come to understand more completely over time, was that the rumors weren't random. They were targeted. Victor Langford had offered twice to buy the strip of land along Ashcroft Creek, and twice Silas had declined, politely the first time and less politely the second. The creek was the ranch's life. It watered the cattle, it could be used to irrigate if the drought years came, and it ran through land that a man with Langford's interests would find extremely useful. The 5-year loan existed, Evelyn had begun to suspect, not because Silas had needed money so desperately, but because Langford had offered terms that seemed reasonable and had taken a banker's patient view of what might happen across 5 years. She didn't say any of this out loud. Not yet. She had suspicion and observation, and 14 months of ranch records she'd begun quietly reading through in the evenings when the household had gone to bed, sitting at the kitchen table with a candle and the ledger Silas kept in the desk off the hallway, which he hadn't said she couldn't look at, and which he'd seemed, when she'd asked indirectly, to think was a reasonable thing for someone trying to help manage the household to be aware of. The numbers in those ledgers told a story. Not a complete one yet, but the shape of something was beginning to emerge from the columns of figures, an architecture of pressure applied slowly and from several directions at once, subtle enough that a man dealing with grief and 6 sons and a cattle operation might not notice it until it was very close. She noticed it. It was Daniel who surprised her first. Daniel, the 10-year-old with the furnace of anger in his chest, who had broken things and glared at her and once told her to stop touching his mother's curtains when she'd taken them down to wash them. She'd washed them anyway and put them back the same day, which had seemed to confuse him. One afternoon she found him in the barn, sitting in the corner behind the feed bins where no one would easily see him, his knees pulled up and his face doing something complicated. She almost left. Then she sat down on a bale of hay across from him and didn't say anything because she'd learned early that some kinds of pain are frightened off by words. They sat like that for almost 10 minutes. "I broke Pa's compass," Daniel said finally. "The good one. The one Grandpa gave him." She didn't ask how. She didn't ask why. She already knew why, more or less, even if Daniel didn't. "Accidents happen," she said. "It wasn't an accident," he said. He looked at her then, and his eyes were red at the rims. "I don't even know why I did it. I needed something to happen. Something to, I don't know. I don't know why. Because you're 10 years old and your mother died and the world stopped making sense," she said. "And when things stop making sense, sometimes you need to break something real so the breaking is on the outside where you can see it." He stared at her. "That's not," he started. "I'm not saying it was right," she said. "You'll need to tell your father, and you should, but I'm telling you I understand why it happened." Daniel looked down at his knees. His jaw was working the way Caleb's did, the same shape of held-back feeling, made by the same loss, wearing slightly different faces. "Will you be there?" he said, "when I tell him?" "If you want me to be." He thought about it, then nodded. She was there. Silas took the news with the exhausted patience of a man who had been receiving difficult information for 14 months and had learned to absorb it without flinching. He was quiet for a long moment, looking at his youngest present son, and then he said, "Come here," and put his hand on the back of Daniel's neck and held him there. Not a hug exactly, just contact, the kind of contact that says I'm still here without having to find the words. Daniel didn't cry, but some of the furnace went out of his face. That evening, for the first time, Elias stayed in the front room after supper instead of disappearing to the bunkhouse or the barn. He sat at the table with a piece of harness leather he was working on, not talking, not acknowledging anyone in particular, just present, just there. Evelyn sat across the room mending a shirt of Tommy's that had developed a hole in the elbow. The fire was going. The wind was doing its usual work outside, looking for gaps in the walls. Nobody said anything for almost an hour. It was the most peace the Ashcroft house had held in longer than any of them could clearly remember, and none of them mentioned it, because mentioning it would have made it fragile, and it wasn't fragile yet. Outside, somewheres the dark valley, Victor Langford was eating supper in his well-heated house, and Margaret Langford was telling a neighbor woman over tea that she'd heard the Ashcroft ranch hand, she called Evelyn that, ranch hand, had a history that didn't bear close examination. And the neighbor woman had leaned in, the way people do, and said, "Oh, what kind of history?" And Margaret had smiled the particular smile of someone releasing something into the world that they know will travel, and said, "Well, I really couldn't say. I just think Silas Ashcroft has enough trouble already without adding to it." Evelyn didn't know any of this yet. She was sitting by a fire, mending a small boy's shirt, listening to the sound of a family that was beginning, slowly and imperfectly, and with considerable distance still to go, to breathe again. But the trouble was coming. It was already moving through the valley, quiet and patient and wearing a respectable coat. The foreclosure notice arrived on a Wednesday morning in early November, delivered by a young man from Langford's bank who had the decency to look embarrassed about it. He handed it to Elias, who was the first one out to the road, and rode away before anyone else came out of the house. Elias read it standing in the yard, and by the time Silas came out to see what the writer had wanted, the color had left his eldest son's face in a way that made Silas's stomach drop before he even reached for the paper. He read it twice. Then he folded it along its original crease and held it at his side. "Pa," Elias said. "I know." "The date on it." "I know, Elias." The date gave them 45 days. The amount listed was not the amount Silas believed he owed, and that discrepancy, that specific wrong number, was what Evelyn focused on when Silas brought the notice inside and set it on the kitchen table without a word, and stood looking at it like a man looking at a hole in the ground he hadn't seen coming. She picked it up. She read it. She set it down. "This isn't right," she said. "Langford says it is. Langford's wrong or Langford's lying." She tapped the figure. "This has compound interest calculated at a rate you didn't agree to. I've been through your ledgers. Your original agreement was fixed rate, simple interest, 4% annually. This number is based on something closer to 7, compounded quarterly." Silas looked at her. "You can tell that from looking at it?" "I can tell because I spent the last 3 weeks going through every entry in those ledgers and cross-referencing against the payment receipts in your desk drawer." She held his gaze. "I wasn't prying. I was trying to understand the situation. I should have said something sooner." He was quiet for a moment, not angry, processing. "How much of a difference does it make? The difference between what you actually owe and what he's claiming is somewhere around $400. She watched his face. "That's a number worth fighting." "Fighting Victor Langford in Harlan County is not a small thing," Silas said. "No," she said, "it's not." They looked at each other across the kitchen table with the foreclosure notice between them, and the thing that passed between them in that moment was not a plan and not a promise. It was something more provisional than either of those, more like two people standing at the edge of the same difficult territory and not yet decided whether they were going in together. Elias, who had been standing in the doorway, said, "What do you need from the ledgers?" Evelyn looked at him. It was the first time he'd offered her anything directly. "All of them," she said. "Every year going back to when the loan was signed, and the original loan document if you have it." "I know where it is," Elias said, and left to get it. The next week was the hardest sustained kind of difficult. Not dramatic, not punctuated by crisis, just the grinding, meticulous work of going through numbers that didn't want to cooperate. Evelyn sat at the kitchen table most evenings with the ledgers spread across the surface, a candle positioned where it would do the most good, and a piece of paper where she was building a column-by-column reconstruction of what the legitimate debt actually was. Henry sat with her sometimes, not because he understood the accounting, but because he'd apparently decided she shouldn't do it alone. He sharpened pencils, brought her coffee, occasionally asked questions she answered without looking up. What she found, the more carefully she looked, was worse than simple overcharging. It was a system. A patient, carefully constructed system of small manipulations, each one individually explainable, collectively amounting to something that was not an accident. A processing fee added in year 2 that wasn't in the original agreement. A quarterly statement that had arrived 30 days late, too late for Silas to dispute an entry before the next compound period began. A cattle valuation assessment in year 3, commissioned by the bank and paid for by the borrower per a clause, buried in paragraph 9 of the original document, that had undervalued the Ashcroft herd by nearly a third, reducing Silas's negotiating position if he'd wanted to refinance. None of it was obvious. All of it was intentional. She didn't tell Silas everything at once. She told him in pieces because all at once would have been the kind of blow that makes a man want to do something immediate and inadvisable, and what this situation required was not immediacy. Caleb found out before she intended him to. He came in late from the barn one night when he'd assumed she was finished working and found her still at the table with the papers spread out, and before she could put anything away, he'd come close enough to see the numbers and the notes in her handwriting. "Is that what I think it is?" he said. She considered lying and immediately discarded it. "Depends on what you think it is." "Evidence that Langford's been cheating us." "Yes," she said. Caleb pulled out a chair and sat down. He looked at the papers for a long moment. His jaw was doing the thing. Then he looked at her and said, "What do we do with it?" She noticed he said "we." She filed that away. "Territorial Land Authority," she said. "There's an office in Billings. If we can get this documentation in front of the right person, someone who isn't already in Langford's pocket, it gives Silas grounds to contest the foreclosure and potentially to pursue repayment of the overcharged amounts." "That's a long way," Caleb said, "and it takes time we don't have." "I know, which is why we need to talk to some of the neighboring ranchers first. If Langford's done this to one family, he's likely done it to others. The more people bringing documentation to Billings, the harder it is to ignore." Caleb leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling. "Pruitt won't even talk to Pa right now." "Not to your Pa, maybe," she said. "People's positions shift when the thing affecting your neighbor turns out to also be affecting you." He looked at her. "You think you can get Pruitt to talk?" "I think a woman showing up with a ledger is less threatening than a man showing up with his pride on the line," she said, "which sometimes matters." For the first time, Caleb Ashcroft almost smiled. It wasn't a full smile. It was the reluctant, sideways approximation of one, the kind that appears despite a person's better judgment. Then he stood up. "I'll ride with you," he said. "Someone should." She looked at him. "All right," she said. They rode to the Pruitt Ranch 2 days later, Caleb quiet for most of the ride, in a way that wasn't hostile, just thoughtful. She'd been around him enough now to distinguish between his silences. This was the silence of someone recalculating something. "He's going to ask why you care," Caleb said, about a mile out from the Pruitt gate. "He is," she agreed. "What are you going to tell him?" She thought about it honestly. "That I'm staying at the Ashcroft Ranch, and what happens to it happens to me too." Caleb was quiet for a moment. "Is that true?" She kept her eyes on the road ahead. "Getting to be," she said. The conversation with Gerald Pruitt was not easy. He was a weathered man in his late 50s, careful and slow to commit, with the deep-seated caution of someone who'd been burned before by getting involved in other people's disputes. He listened to her lay out the documentation with his arms crossed and his mouth flat, and when she finished, he looked at Caleb. "Your pa know you're here." "He knows," Caleb said. Pruitt looked back at Evelyn. "Why should I believe Langford's doing the same to me?" "Do you have your original loan documents?" she said. "Of course." "Do you have all your payment receipts?" A pause. "Most of them." "Would you be willing to let me look at them against your statements? I can tell you in an hour whether the numbers line up." Another pause, longer. Pruitt looked at her with the particular scrutiny of a man who'd spent a lifetime assessing reliability in horses and was now applying the same method to a person. Then he went inside and came back with a wooden box. It took 50 minutes. What she found in Pruitt's records was smaller than what she'd found in Silas's Valan, but it was there. The same pattern, different amounts, the same invisible fingerprints of a man who'd been practicing this for years. Pruitt sat across from her at his kitchen table and looked at the numbers she'd laid out for him without speaking for a full 2 minutes. "Son of a—" he started and caught himself. He looked at Caleb. "How many other ranches you think he's done this to?" "That's what we're trying to find out," Caleb said. Pruitt looked at Evelyn. "You put this together yourself?" "I did. Where'd you learn accounting like this?" She considered how much to say. "My husband ran a mill," she said. "I kept the books for 6 years. And then I kept the books for the bank that held our loan after he died, because the loan manager made a similar kind of mistake, and I was the only one who noticed. Pruitt absorbed this. What happened? The bank corrected the error, she said, which was a simplified version of a longer and considerably uglier story, but it was true as far as it went. He nodded slowly. Then, who else have you talked to? The week that followed had a different kind of momentum. Pruitt spoke to his neighbor Hatch, who spoke to the Birch brothers 2 valleys over, and by the time Evelyn had visited 3 more ranches with her ledger and her careful columns of numbers, something had shifted in the community's relationship to the information it had been sitting on without knowing it. 2 of the families she visited had records that showed the same patterns. One didn't. Langford had apparently decided that family wasn't worth the complexity, which told its own story about who he considered vulnerable and who he considered protected. All of them were angry. Most of them were also scared because Victor Langford held loans on nearly half the productive land in the valley, and his goodwill was the kind of thing people had learned to maintain at some cost. But scared and angry together, when directed by something that looks like it might actually work, is more combustible than either one alone. Silas knew what she was doing, in broad terms, and had not told her to stop. That was, she understood, the closest thing to endorsement she was going to get from a man who didn't like accepting help and was currently in the position of needing it badly. She didn't push for more. She worked with what she had. The night everything nearly came apart started with smoke. It was past midnight on a Thursday, cold and dry and windy in the way that November in Montana could be. The kind of wind that comes from the north with something personal against anything stationary. She woke to the smell first, thin and distant, the particular character of burning grass rather than burning wood. She was out of her storage room and on the back porch before she was fully awake, and what she saw to the southwest made her stomach turn to ice. The ridgeline above the Hennessy grazing flats was lit orange against the black sky. Not a small fire. A moving fire, the kind driven by wind, the kind that covered ground faster than a horse could comfortably run in the dark over rough terrain. Silas had ridden out at midday with Elias, Jonah, and Caleb to move cattle from the northern pasture, a 2-day job at minimum. She was at the ranch with Henry, Seth, Daniel, and Tommy. She stood on that porch for exactly 4 seconds. Then she was moving. "Henry!" She shook him awake. "Fire on the Hennessy Ridge! Get up! Now!" Henry was on his feet and pulling on boots before she finished the sentence. 14 years old, and he didn't ask questions when the situation was loud enough to answer them itself. She got Seth up next, then Daniel. Tommy she sat up carefully and held by both arms. "I need you to listen to me," she said. "There's a fire coming down from the ridge. It's not here yet, but I need you to do exactly what I tell you." Tommy's eyes were wide, but his chin was steady. He nodded. "You stay close to me," she said. "You don't go anywhere without telling me first. You understand?" "Yes," he said. She went out to the yard and climbed the fence post to get a better sight line. The fire was moving northeast, which meant the wind was carrying it toward the lower grazing land, toward the draw, toward the dry grass of the Ashcroft South pasture, toward 3 neighboring ranches further down the valley. It had at most 2 hours before it hit the first fence line, maybe less. She could see a light moving on the Pruitt Road. Someone else awake. Someone else who'd seen it. "Henry," she called. "Ride to Pruitt. Tell him fire on the Hennessy Ridge moving northeast. Tell him to get everyone he can to the south draw with shovels, and we'll cut a fire break along the creek bank. Go." Henry went. She heard hooves on the road within 60 seconds. She turned to Seth. "I need the longest shovels in the barn, the 2 grubbing hoes, and every bucket. Bring them to the creek gate." "There's only us," Seth said. Not refusing, stating a fact, the way someone does when they need the plan to account for reality. "There won't be in 20 minutes, she said. "Go." She was at the creek with Daniel and Tommy by the time Seth came with the tools, and she'd already been thinking through the geography of it, the way the land lay between the fire's current position and the ranch buildings, the way the creek curved along the bottom of the draw and created a natural barrier if you could widen it, if you could burn back from it in a controlled way, if you could get enough people with shovels to cut the grass line at the right point. Pruitt arrived with 4 men inside 15 minutes, which told her everything about how clearly that fire was visible from his property. Hatch came behind him with 2 of his ranch hands. Then a family she didn't know by name, who'd seen the light from their road. She organized them the way she'd organized everything else. Practically, without ceremony, without asking if anyone minded taking direction from a woman who'd shown up at a ranch 6 weeks ago with a canvas bag. She didn't give them time to mind. "Fire break here," she said, marking a line with her boot heel in the dirt. 15 feet wide down to bare earth. Don't touch the creek bank vegetation. We need that moisture in place. If the wind shifts, everyone moves east immediately. No debate, no waiting. Does everyone understand? Pruitt looked at her for 1 second, just one, with an expression she couldn't fully read. Then he jammed his shovel into the earth and started digging. She worked alongside them, her coat discarded within 10 minutes, her arms aching within 20, the smoke thickening as the fire moved down the ridge with a sound like tearing fabric, heard from a great distance. A sound that grew as it got closer until it was a sound you felt in your chest. The creek, she'd understood this from the start, was the key. The water level in the draw was good for November, fed by the same creek that Langford had been trying to get his hands on for 2 years, and she used it. She organized a relay of buckets, soaking the grass on the near side of the fire break to create a wet barrier that would slow the advance even if the cut line wasn't enough. Daniel worked the relay with the focus of a boy who had redirected every ounce of his furnace of anger into something that actually needed it, moving with a speed and determination that made the men around him step aside automatically. Tommy stayed at her side as promised. He was small enough that she'd put him on bucket-filling duty at the creek bank, which kept him low and at the water's edge, away from the smoke that was building into a genuine wall to the southwest. She was at the fire break when she heard him scream, not a scream of pain, a scream of surprise, of sudden fear. The particular register of a child who has just understood that something is wrong. She turned, and the burning brand had come down from somewhere, a piece of fence post or a tree limb carried on the wind, and landed on the roof of the small equipment shed at the south end of the barn complex. The shed was dry wood and old thatch, and it went up fast, the kind of fast that removes your choices one by one. Tommy was between her and the shed, frozen, staring at it. She crossed the ground between them at a run, grabbed him by the arm, got him moving away from the shed and toward the creek. She handed him to Pruitt, "Hold him," and turned back. The shed door was latched but not locked. She had it open in 4 seconds. Inside in the far corner was what she'd expected. The winter stores, the seed stock for next spring, and the wooden crates where Silas kept equipment records and ranch documents going back 15 years. Including, she was almost certain, the original loan documents she'd been working from copies of. The roof above her was burning. Not fully engaged, but getting there, and getting there fast. She grabbed the crates, 2 of them, awkward and heavy, and dragged them toward the door. The second one caught on the door frame, and she had to drop it, reposition, lift with both arms from a dead crouch. She got them both out. She was 3 strides clear of the door when the roof came down. The sound was enormous and immediate, and the heat from it hit her like a wall. She kept moving, dragging the crates, until she was clear of the heat zone and could set them down on the creek bank and stand up and breathe in air that wasn't smoke. She stood there for a moment, hands on her knees, lungs working hard. "Miss Evelyn," it was Tommy's voice, directly behind her. She turned. He was standing there with Pruitt's hand on his shoulder, and his face was doing something very complicated. Then he walked forward and put both arms around her waist and held on, the way children do when they have been frightened and want to establish that something solid is still present in the world. She put her hand on the back of his head and held him there. The firebreak held. Not perfectly. They lost a section of the south fence line and the equipment shed was gone. But the main line held, and the creek did what a good creek does when you give it room to work. And by 3 in the morning, the fire had lost its momentum against the cut earth and the wet grass and the hard work of 12 people who'd had very little notice and no margin for error. When it was over, Pruitt stood beside her at the edge of the firebreak and looked out at the smoldering hillside. His face was black with soot and his hands were blistered. He looked older than he had yesterday, and calmer at the same time, the way people sometimes look after they've been through something that sorted everything into what matters and what doesn't. 3 ranches would have burned, he said. Mine included. She didn't answer. You ever command men before? He asked. No, she said. He made a sound that was almost a laugh. Could have fooled me. The men who had come out that night, Pruitt, Hatch, the others, stood in the smoky dark of a Montana November and looked at what they'd managed to save, and the woman who had organized them to save it. Nobody made a speech. Nobody needed to. But something had shifted, the way things shift when people witness something together and can't unknow it afterward. Silas came back with the older boys before dawn, driving hard because he'd seen the glow from the northern road. He pulled up at the gate and took in the burned shed, the fire break, the smoke still rising from the ridge, and the cluster of neighbors in his yard who should not have been there at 3 in the morning. And he looked at Evelyn with an expression she hadn't seen on his face before. She was sitting on the crates she'd pulled from the shed, her coat back on, Tommy asleep against her shoulder the way small children sleep after great fear, heavy and sudden and total. Silas got down from his horse and walked toward her and stopped about 4 feet away and just looked at her for a long moment. "You all right?" he said. "I'm fine," she said. "Tommy's fine. Everybody's fine." He looked at the burned shed, at the fire break, at Pruitt and Hatch standing in his yard at 3 in the morning, back at her. "The documents from the shed," she said. "I got them out before the roof went. They're in the crates." Something moved through his face. Something she couldn't name and didn't try to. He looked at the crates beside her. He looked at Tommy asleep against her shoulder. He looked at his yard full of neighbors who had come when it mattered and stayed until the work was done. He didn't say anything for a moment. When he did, his voice was quieter than usual, the particular quiet of a man who has had something happen to him that he hasn't finished processing yet. "Come inside when you're ready," he said. "I'll put coffee on." She nodded. He went toward the house, and she stayed where she was a little longer, one hand resting on the wooden crate, one hand on Tommy's shoulder, watching the smoke drift east against the first gray suggestion of morning coming up behind the Bitterroot Ridge. The ranch was still standing. The documents were safe. The neighbors were here. It wasn't enough yet, but it was something to work with. The coffee Silas made that morning was too strong and slightly burnt, and it was the best thing she'd tasted in weeks. She sat at the kitchen table while he stood at the stove with his back to her, and neither of them spoke for a while. Outside, the last of the neighbors had gone home. Elias and the older boys were checking the fire break in the gray early light, walking the line to see what had held and what hadn't. Henry had finally gone to sleep somewhere around 4 in the morning, sitting in a chair in the front room with his head tilted back, out the way only someone genuinely spent can go out. Tommy was on the corn shuck mattress in her storage room, which she'd moved him to without waking him, still wearing his boots. Silas set a cup in front of her and sat down across the table. He'd been doing a quiet kind of accounting since he'd ridden in and seen the yard. She could see it in the way he looked at things, calculating what it had cost, what it had saved, what it meant that Gerald Pruitt and 3 other men had shown up in the middle of the night to defend someone else's land. That kind of thing didn't happen in Harlan County without a reason, and he understood that she was the reason, even if he didn't yet know all the mechanism of it. "Tell me what happened," he said. "All of it." So she told him. The fire first, where she'd seen it, what she'd assessed, what she'd done. He listened without interrupting, which she appreciated. When she got to the part about the equipment shed and the roof, his jaw tightened. "You went back in," he said. "The documents were in there." "The documents." He said it in a tone that was not quite anger and not quite something else. "You went back into a burning building for documents. The original loan documents," she said. "The ones with Langford's signature on the actual agreed interest rate." "Yes." He looked at her for a long moment. His coffee sat untouched. "I've spent 6 weeks reading your ledgers," she said. "I wasn't going to let 4 years of evidence burn up because I was careful about my own comfort." "It's not your comfort I'm talking about," he said. The way he said it landed differently than she expected. She looked at him directly, and he looked back at her. And there was something in the room for a moment that neither of them addressed because the morning was too raw and too tired and too complicated for that kind of conversation, and they both seemed to understand it. "The documents are in the crates on the porch," she said, "and that's what matters right now." He picked up his coffee, drank it, set it down. "Tell me about Pruitt." She told him that too. The visits, the ledger comparisons, the patterns she'd found in multiple sets of ranch records. She laid it out the way she'd laid out numbers for him before, factual and sequential, without dramatizing it. The more she talked, the more still he got, which was something she'd learned about him. Silas Ashcroft went very quiet when he was genuinely angry. Not the surface quiet of composure, but the deeper quiet of a man rearranging his understanding of his own situation and not enjoying what the new arrangement looked like. When she finished, he was quiet for long enough that she counted the seconds without meaning to. He built it into the original agreement, Silas said finally. It wasn't a question. The clause about the valuation assessment was there from the beginning. The compounding error was introduced in year 2, in a quarterly statement, small enough that you'd need to be looking for it to find it. And the late statement. Engineered, she said. I believe so. The timing is too consistent across multiple borrowers to be accident. He stood up, went to the window, stood looking out at the morning with his hands behind his back, and she waited. I signed that document, he said to the window. I read it. I thought I understood it. It was designed to be misunderstood, she said. That's not the same as you being careless. He didn't respond to that. She could see the tension in his shoulders, not just anger at Langford, but the specific grinding humiliation of a man who prides himself on taking care of his own and discovering he's been managed without knowing it. That was its own kind of wound, separate from the financial one, and it would need its own time. How long before Langford knows the fire didn't take the records? She asked. Silas turned from the window. The question brought him back to the practical, which was where he was more comfortable. He'll hear about the fire today. Men talk. He'll hear about the fire break, about the neighbors. He'll wonder what was in the shed. He paused. He'll move faster now. Then we need to move faster too, she said. He looked at her with something she'd seen before. The expression of a man who has spent a year operating alone and has just realized that operating alone is no longer the only option. It wasn't a comfortable look, but it was an honest one. What do you need from me? He said. A wagon and 2 days, she said. I want to go to Billings. The preparation took 3 days, not 2, because the documentation had to be organized in a way that would survive contact with a territorial official who had no particular reason to be sympathetic and several reasons to be cautious. Evelyn worked with Elias on this. Elias, who had finished his law of distances and was now the closest thing to an ally she had among the older boys, who turned out to have a precise and orderly mind that was genuinely useful when what you needed was someone to tell you where your argument had gaps. He found 2 gaps. She fixed them. It was the most they'd talked, and it was almost entirely about numbers, but by the end of the second day there was something between them that hadn't been there before. Not warmth exactly, but the particular respect that comes from watching someone work and recognizing that they know what they're doing. You could have done this a long time ago, he said, looking at the organized documentation spread across the kitchen table. You've had most of this for weeks. I needed more ranchers, she said. 1 family contesting a bank is a dispute. 4 families with documentation is a pattern. He thought about that. How many do we have? Pruitt, the Hatches, the Birch brothers, and the Coulter widow on the East Road who I talked to after the fire. She's been dealing with the same thing and thought it was her own accounting error. 5 families. Yes. He straightened the papers in front of him. Is it enough? She was honest. I don't know, but it's what we have. Caleb insisted on coming to Billings. She'd expected to take Elias, but Caleb came to her the morning of departure and said, I'm coming, in a tone that was not a request, and she looked at him and said, all right, and that was the negotiation. He'd changed in the past weeks in ways she'd been careful not to make a point of, because making a point of it would have embarrassed him, and embarrassment would have reversed the progress. But he had. The furnace of it had cooled from rage into something more directed, more usable. Still heat, but with a purpose attached. On the road to Billings, a full day's drive in the wagon, Caleb said something that surprised her. They were an hour outside of town, the road straightening out through a wide plain with the mountains behind them, and he said, without looking at her, I used to think Pa was going to lose the ranch anyway. Even before Langford, after Mama, I thought he'd just stop fighting at some point. She kept her eyes on the road. What made you think that? Because I almost did, he said. Stop fighting after she died. He was quiet for a moment. I figured if I could almost give up, then a grown man dealing with more than me. I thought maybe it was just a matter of time. She considered this. Your father hasn't given up. No, Caleb said. He hasn't. Another pause. I didn't understand why until recently. She didn't ask him to explain that because she thought she understood what he was saying, and she didn't want to make it into something he'd feel the need to take back. The Territorial Land and Claims Office in Billings was on the second floor of a stone building that smelled of pipe tobacco and old paper, staffed by a man named Arden Colfax, who wore spectacles and a permanently guarded expression, and who had clearly made a study of not being influenced by whoever was currently standing in his office. He was exactly the kind of bureaucrat who was either going to be very useful or completely useless, with nothing in between. He looked at Evelyn and Caleb when they came in and said, without inflection, "Help you?" "We have a filing to make," Evelyn said, "regarding fraudulent interest practices by the Harlan County Bank and an associated contest of a foreclosure notice issued on erroneous grounds." Colfax looked at them over his spectacles. "That's a substantial claim." "Yes," she said, "I have substantial documentation." She put the organized packet on his desk. He looked at it, he looked at her, he opened it. What followed was 2 hours in that office, Colfax reading and occasionally asking questions, and Evelyn answering them with the specific patience of someone who has spent weeks preparing for exactly this conversation and is not going to be rattled by a man who is doing his job properly. Caleb sat in the chair beside her and said almost nothing, but he was present in a way that she understood was intentional. He was there as a witness and as a son of Silas Ashcroft, and as proof that this wasn't one woman making accusations but a family with legitimate standing in the territory. Colfax put down the last page and took off his spectacles and cleaned them, which seemed to be what he did when he was thinking. "You have 5 families' records here," he said. "I do. All showing the same pattern of discrepancy." "Yes." "This valuation clause in the original document." He tapped a page. "Who drafted this original loan agreement?" "Victor Langford's office," she said. "The borrower had no independent legal counsel. That's standard practice for ranch loans in the valley. Langford has been the only creditor operating there for 7 years. Colfax put his spectacles back on. "If what you're showing me holds up under examination, and I'm not saying it does yet, this would constitute grounds not just for a foreclosure contest, but for a broader investigation of the bank's lending practices." "Yes," she said. "That's why we're here." He looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't entirely categorize. "You put this documentation together yourself." "I did." "You have a background in accounting?" "I kept books for a mill for 6 years and then for a lending institution for 2, before circumstances changed." He seemed to accept this without needing the circumstances explained. He wrote something on a form, stamped it with more force than seemed strictly necessary, and handed her a copy. "This is a formal receipt of filing," he said. "The contest of foreclosure is officially on record as of today's date, which means no action on the property can proceed until the matter is reviewed. I'll have an investigator dispatched to Harlan County within 10 days. Caleb exhaled beside her. It was a sound he was trying to control and only partially succeeding. 10 days, she said. Understood. Don't lose that receipt, Colfax said. I won't, she said. She and Caleb were back on the street outside the building before either of them said anything. Then Caleb put both hands on the back of his head and looked at the sky. 10 days, he said. 10 days, she agreed. Langford's going to know. Yes. He's going to do something. Probably, she said. Which is why we need to be back by nightfall tomorrow. They drove back through the late afternoon light, and Caleb talked more on the return journey than he had on any previous occasion in her presence, which he understood was the release of pressure that had been building since the foreclosure notice had arrived. He talked about the ranch, about his brothers, about a particular stretch of fence line on the north pasture that he'd been wanting to fix for 2 years and kept getting pulled away from. He talked about what he wanted the ranch to look like in 10 years, not with the self-consciousness of someone making plans they don't believe in, but with the careful, tentative investment of someone who is beginning to allow themselves to want something again. She listened more than she talked, which was what the situation asked for. Victor Langford made his move the following Monday. She heard about it first from Henry, who'd been in town for feed, and had the look he got when he was carrying something he didn't know how to put down. He came in through the kitchen door and stood there for a moment, and she looked at him and said, "Tell me." Langford called in the Corey family's loan, Henry said, due in full, in 30 days. The Coreys weren't one of the families in the Billings filing. They'd declined, politely but firmly, when she'd approached them because Joe Corey and Victor Langford went to the same church and had the kind of relationship built on 20 years of small favors, and Joe couldn't bring himself to see it the way the numbers showed it. They had 4 children and 180 acres of decent pasture land. "That's a warning," Caleb said from the doorway. He'd heard from the hallway. "He's showing what he can do." "He's showing what he will do," Evelyn said, "to anyone who joins the filing." Silas came in from outside, and Henry told him. Silas stood very still for a moment, then sat down at the kitchen table with the particular slowness of a man who is managing himself carefully. "Joe Corey's got 4 kids," Silas said. "I know," Evelyn said. "If he loses that land, he might not have to." She pulled out the chair across from him and sat down. "If Colfax's investigator finds what I believe he'll find, Langford's position in this valley is going to collapse. When that happens, the Corey loan and every other loan he holds gets transferred to whatever institution takes over the bank's assets, and those terms are subject to renegotiation." "That's a lot of ifs," Silas said. "Yes," she said. "It is." He looked at the table for a moment, then he looked at her. "You still believe we're going to win this?" It wasn't entirely a question. "I believe the evidence is strong and the filing is solid, and Colfax is the kind of man who follows evidence," she said. "That's not the same as certain, but it's not nothing." He held her gaze. "No," he said. "It's not nothing. The investigator arrived in 8 days, not 10. A compact, windburned man named Aldous Reeves, who rode a gray horse and asked very few questions during his introduction, and a great many during the 2 days he spent going through the Langford bank records, which he had territorial authority to demand, and which Langford, by all accounts, produced with the controlled fury of a man who knows he's been caught but hasn't accepted it yet. Reeves interviewed Evelyn twice. The second interview was longer than the first, more specific, and ended with him looking at her across the table in Pruitt's front room, neutral ground, and saying, "The compounding error alone is recoverable in court. The valuation clause, given standard practice in the territory, puts us in different territory. Who was your source for the standard practice comparison?" She slid 3 pages across to him. He read them. His expression didn't change, but he nodded once. "You're thorough," he said. "I've had time," she said. The thing about Langford's collapse was that it wasn't dramatic in the way that collapses are in stories. It was paperwork and formal notices and a meeting of Valley ranchers that Evelyn did not attend because it wasn't her place to attend it, held at the Pruitt Ranch, where Reeves presented his findings to the assembled landholders, and read from a document that used the specific language of territorial authority to convey that Victor Langford was under investigation for systematic fraudulent lending practices, that a foreclosure contest had been upheld, and that the Harlan County Bank was being placed under oversight pending a full review. Silas came home from that meeting and sat down in the front room, in the chair next to the rocking chair that nobody sat in, and was quiet for a long time. She let him be quiet. Eventually, Tommy came and climbed into his lap without asking, which was Tommy's way, and Silas put his arm around him automatically, the way fathers do when the motion has been made 10,000 times and lives below the level of conscious thought. "It's over?" Tommy said. "Most of it," Silas said. "Are we keeping the ranch?" "We're keeping the ranch." Tommy processed this with the practicality of a child for whom the ranch is simply the world, and losing it would have meant losing the world, and keeping it is therefore the correct outcome, and also somewhat abstract. He reached up and patted Silas's face once, the way children do to confirm that something is real and present and still there. The legitimate debt, the actual amount correctly calculated, was paid off through a combination of Silas's remaining cash reserves and a short-term loan from a territorial credit cooperative that Reeves had quietly suggested as an alternative to Langford's institution. The interest rate was straightforward, the terms were plain, and the document was 3 pages long and had no clauses buried in paragraph 9. Evelyn signed the payment receipt when Silas asked her to witness it, which she understood was not a practical request, but a different kind of one. The week that followed was the first week since she'd arrived that felt something like normal. Not quiet. A house with 6 boys in it was not quiet, but normal in the sense of moving forward rather than bracing for what was coming next. Caleb and Elias worked the north fence line together and came in arguing about the right way to set a corner post, which was, she had come to understand, the Ashcroft brothers' preferred mode of communication and a significant improvement over silence. Daniel had taken on the morning feeding without being asked, an ownership of responsibility that was new and that nobody commented on directly because commenting on it would have made it fragile. Seth had started talking again. Not a lot, but more, with the tentative quality of someone testing whether the words would hold. And Henry had asked her one morning while she was at the stove if she would teach him to keep books. She'd turned to look at him. He was 14, serious-faced, with his mother's eyes and his father's jaw, and his own particular kind of intelligence that expressed itself in silence and in noticing things other people missed. "You want to learn accounting?" she said. "I want to understand how somebody nearly took our ranch by hiding things in numbers," he said, "so it can't happen again." She looked at him for a long moment. "Pull up a chair," she said. It was 3 days after the settlement was confirmed on a Friday evening, with the temperature dropping and the first real winter cold settling into the valley for keeps, that she went out to the storage room after supper and found it different from how she'd left it. Not dramatically, not obviously. She almost didn't notice it in the low light. Then she set her candle on the crate and looked. The dirt floor had been planked. Not the incomplete, half-hearted planking of the original floor, but proper boards, fitted and leveled, the edges sanded. There was a small iron stove against the east wall. The spare stove from the bunkhouse, she thought, cleaned and set on a flagstone base with a new length of pipe run up through a mortared hole in the wall. The corn shuck mattress was gone, replaced by an actual wooden bed frame with a proper ticking mattress on it, made up with a quilt she recognized from the cedar chest in the upstairs hall. The window, the small, too-high window, had been enlarged. Not enormously, but enough to see out of properly, enough to let in morning light, framed in new wood that still smelled of sawdust. On the crate that served as her table, someone had placed a small glass jar with 3 dried wildflowers in it. Late-season things, brown at the edges, clearly found rather than bought. Tommy's contribution. She knew it without needing to be told. She stood in the middle of the room for a while. Just stood there. She heard footsteps in the kitchen and turned. Silas was in the doorway. He looked at the room rather than at her, which was how she knew he was the one who had organized it. He was checking his own work. "Boys did most of it," he said. "Caleb and Elias on the floor. Henry and Seth on the stovepipe. Daniel found the bed frame in the back of the barn, said it wasn't being used." A pause. "Tommy picked the flowers." "I know," she said. He looked at her then. The candle threw uneven light across his face, and he looked tired in the way he always looked tired, but there was something else there too, something less defended than usual. "I know it's not much," he said. "Silas?" Her voice was steadier than she expected. "It's more than I've had in 2 years." He stood in the doorway, and she stood in the middle of a room that had been given to her without being asked for, and the wind outside was doing what the Montana wind does in November, and the stove in the corner was ticking as it found its heat. And somewhere in the house, one of the boys was arguing with another one about something that didn't matter at all and mattered enormously. And she breathed in the smell of new wood and the particular cold, clean smell of a room that has been cared for. "You've been preparing to leave since you got here," Silas said. She didn't deny it. She had been. A corner of her had kept the canvas bag packed in a way that wasn't entirely practical, had kept a part of her weight on her back foot, ready. "I know," she said. "I'm asking you not to," he said. I'm not asking you to stay because of the ranch or because of the boys, though both of those things are true." He stopped. Tried again, with the labored honesty of a man who doesn't speak this language easily. "I'm asking because the house makes more sense with you in it, and so do I. And I don't know how else to say that." She looked at him for a long moment. "You could have just shown me the room," she said. Something crossed his face, almost a smile. "The real kind, the rare kind." "I could have," he said. The candle between them was steady for once, the flame upright and still, and she held the moment the way you hold something you know you've been moving toward, without being able to see it clearly until you arrive. "All right," she said. "I'll stay." He nodded, once, the way he communicated most things. Then he said, "Supper's still on the table if you want it." and went back into the kitchen. She stood in her room a moment longer. Her room. She turned once, slowly, looking at the planked floor, the small stove ticking warmth into the cold air, the window that could now see sky. Then she went into supper. Winter came to the Ashcroft Ranch the way it always came to that part of Montana, without asking permission and without apology. By the first week of December, the creek had a skin of ice along its edges each morning, and the mountains to the west had gone white all the way down to the timberline, and the sky on clear days was the particular hard blue of extreme cold, beautiful in the way that things are beautiful when they are also dangerous. Evelyn had lived through hard winters before, but she had never lived through one with a house around her that felt like it was actually hers to be inside of. And that difference, the specific quiet difference between sheltering somewhere and belonging somewhere, turned out to be larger than she'd expected. She noticed it in small ways. The way she stopped calculating how long her boots would last before she'd need to be moving again. The way she started leaving things out on the kitchen shelf instead of putting them back in her canvas bag each night from habit. The way she'd begun, without deciding to, referring to the front room as the front room rather than the front room of the house, as if the possessive were hers to use. She noticed it, and she didn't fight it. The formal business with Aldous Reeves and the territorial authority moved at the speed that formal business always moves, which is to say slowly and with a great deal of paper, but it moved. The Harlan County Bank examination concluded in late November, and the findings were submitted to the territorial governor's office in Helena 3 weeks after that. Victor Langford retained a lawyer from Billings, which suggested he intended to contest the findings, which Reeves had apparently anticipated, because the documentation Evelyn had assembled was thorough enough that the contest went nowhere worth going. She didn't attend any of the proceedings. She didn't need to. Her work was in the paperwork, and the paperwork had done what it was supposed to do. What she heard, through Pruitt and then through Silas, was that Langford had sold his house in town before the formal order came through, had simply packed his household and his wife and left the valley quietly, the way men leave places when they understand that the place has decided it no longer wants them. Margaret Langford apparently wept on the front porch of their house the morning the wagon came. Whether from grief or shame or something else entirely, nobody close enough could say. The house stood empty for most of December, and when people in Harlan County walked past it, they mostly looked at something else. The Corey family's loan was transferred to the Territorial Credit Cooperative as part of the bank asset resolution, and their terms were adjusted to the legitimate rate. Joe Corey came to the Ashcroft Ranch on a Tuesday afternoon in mid-December, which surprised Silas, who hadn't expected to see him. He stood on the porch with his hat in his hands and said he owed Silas an apology for not joining the filing when he'd had the chance. Silas stood in the doorway and looked at him for a moment. "You had your reasons," he said. "I had my relationship with Langford," Joe said. "That's not the same thing as reasons. It's just, I trusted the wrong thing." He turned his hat once by the brim. "Anyway, I'm sorry." Silas stepped back from the door. "Come in and have coffee," he said. "Evelyn made biscuits this morning. There's some left." Joe Corey sat at the Ashcroft table and ate a biscuit and talked to Silas about the winter grazing conditions and the price of beef in Billings and the fence work he was planning for spring. And Evelyn moved around the kitchen without being in the conversation, which was exactly where she was supposed to be. And by the time Joe left, there was something repaired between those two men that had been pulled apart by a third man's manipulation, and that was worth more than any formal proceeding. That was what Evelyn had come to understand in the months since she'd walked up this drive with a worn canvas bag and a single silver coin. That the things worth fighting for were not the things that looked most dramatic from the outside. The ranch was worth fighting for, yes. The documents, the numbers, the formal proceedings, those had mattered enormously. But what they'd been protecting was this: a table with 8 chairs, a front room where people sat after supper, a kitchen where a boy could learn that biscuits require patience, and so do most other things worth making, the ordinary texture of a life shared with other people. That was the thing Langford had actually been trying to take, and that was the thing that had survived him. Christmas at the Ashcroft Ranch that year was not a lavish affair. They didn't have the money for lavish, and even if they had, lavish wasn't really the register the family operated in. Silas cut a pine tree from the east hillside and brought it in on his shoulder and set it in the front room in a bucket of stones, and the boys decorated it with whatever was at hand. Strips of cloth, a few brass buttons, a paper chain that Tommy made with the focused intensity of someone performing important work. It listed slightly to the left and lost 2 branches on the way through the door, and it was the best-looking tree Evelyn had ever seen in a house. She made a supper that took most of the day and was not without incident. She burned the first batch of rolls. Seth knocked a bowl of dried apples off the table, and they went everywhere. And Caleb and Jonah had an argument in the hallway about something involving a saddle that temporarily raised the temperature of the house in ways that had nothing to do with the fire. But supper was on the table by 6, and everyone was at the table, and the candles Evelyn had set out at the center burned with a steadiness that the evening seemed to be actively protecting. Silas sat at the head of the table and looked down its length at his sons and at Evelyn, and he didn't say anything, which was the way he expressed most of what he felt deeply. And Evelyn understood it and didn't require it to be anything other than what it was. Tommy, who was 8 and therefore exempt from adult reticence, said, "This is the best Christmas since Mama's last one." And the table went quiet in the way it goes quiet when a true thing is said in front of people who are all thinking it, and none of them were going to be the one to say it. Silas put his hand on Tommy's shoulder. "Yeah," he said, "it is." Nobody cried. But the thing that was present in that room was real enough to lean against, and they all leaned against it a little, and supper continued. It was Elias who came to her first, in the way that mattered most to her. It was 2 days after Christmas, the house quiet, most of the boys out on various parts of the ranch. She was in the kitchen going through the spring planting catalog she'd ordered from a seed company in Missoula, making notes on what the kitchen garden would need to come back to what it had been, when Elias came in and got himself a cup of coffee and sat down across from her. He was 20 now, in the way that 19 becomes 20 without announcement. He had grown into his frame over the past months, she'd noticed. Less the impression of a boy wearing a man's responsibilities, and more the reality of a young man who had accepted them and was finding out, slowly, who he was underneath them. He sat with his coffee for a moment, looking at the catalog. "You're going to fix the garden," he said. "In spring, yes. Mama had tomatoes in the back row," he said. "The tall kind that need staking. I'll plant those," she said. He was quiet for a moment. His hands were around the coffee cup. "I wasn't kind to you when you first came," he said. She looked up from the catalog. "You weren't unkind." "I wasn't kind," he said again, with the precision of someone who has thought about the distinction. "I wanted you to leave. I didn't say it, but I did. I thought—" He stopped, started again. "I thought if someone came in and made things better, it would mean we'd stopped missing her, like being okay was the same as being over it." She set the catalog down. "It's not," she said. "I know that now," he said. "I think I knew it then too. I just needed someone to blame for having to figure that out." She looked at him steadily. "You don't owe me an apology, Elias." "I think I do," he said. "So I'm giving one. You don't have to do anything with it." She held his gaze. Outside, the wind moved through the pine trees at the edge of the property, the sound she'd been falling asleep to for 3 months now. "Accepted," she said. He nodded once, exactly like his father, and drank his coffee. Silas asked her to marry him on a Sunday evening in January, which was not a day or a month with any particular romantic distinction, which was exactly why it felt true. He'd come to find her where she was in the barn checking on one of the mares who'd been favoring her front left leg for 2 days. She was crouched down with her hand on the horse's fetlock when she heard him come in, and she didn't look up immediately because she was trying to feel what she was trying to feel. "She's going to be all right," Evelyn said. "It's not the joint. Something in the lower muscle. Rest and cold compresses for a week." "All right," Silas said. She stood up. He was standing a few feet away, hat in his hand, which was not where he usually kept his hat when he was in the barn. She looked at him. "You look like Joe Corey did on my porch," she said. Something crossed his face. "I hope not. You've got your hat in your hand." He looked at the hat. Set it on a post. "Better, but not by much." "I've been trying to think of how to say this right," he said. "I've been trying for about 3 weeks, and I've not come up with anything that sounds the way I want it to, so I'm just going to say it plain." "All right," she said. "I want you to be my wife," he said. "Not because you saved the ranch, though you did. Not because my boys need a mother, though I think they're finding out they need you specifically, which is a different thing, because he paused, pushed through it. Because since you came here, I've been living in the house instead of just occupying it, and I didn't know how much difference that was until I had it, and I don't want to go back to the way it was before. She looked at him for a long moment. The mare breathed slowly beside her, warm and indifferent, and the barn smelled of hay and cold wood and horse, and this was the least romantic setting she could have imagined for this conversation, and it was exactly right. "You know I'm not going to be easy," she said. "I know that," he said. "I don't want easy. I have a history you don't know all of." "You can tell me as much of it as you want," he said. "When you want." She looked at him, this tired, honest, difficult man who had let her sleep in his barn, who had drunk burnt coffee at 4 in the morning after a fire and not asked for thanks, who had organized his sons to build her a proper floor and a window that could see sky, who stood in front of her now with his hat on a fence post because he didn't know what else to do with his hands. "Yes," she said. He looked at her. "Yes," she said again. "I'll marry you." He didn't sweep her up or make declarations. He crossed the space between them and took her hand in both of his, and they stood there in the barn with the mare watching them with the beautiful, incurious attention of an animal that has no opinion about human arrangements, and that was enough. The wedding was in March, when the first real thaw broke the valley open and the creek ran full and loud and the mud was assertive and unavoidable, and the world smelled of things coming back to life after months of being held still by cold. It was small. Pruitt and his wife came, and the Hatches, and the Coulter widow from the East Road who had brought a pie that she set on the porch table without being asked. Joe Corey and his family came, which surprised Silas and didn't surprise Evelyn. There was no ceremony beyond what a circuit judge managed in about 8 minutes in the front room, while Tommy stood between Evelyn and the judge, watching the proceedings with the focused attention of someone who understands that important things are happening and intends to remember them. Afterward, Caleb made a toast, which nobody had anticipated, including Caleb, who appeared to surprise himself by standing up with a cup and saying, with the awkward, unchoreographed sincerity of a 16-year-old who hasn't rehearsed this, "I wasn't glad when she came. I want to say that because she knows it already. But I'm glad now. And I think Mama would be too." He sat back down immediately and looked at the table, and the room was quiet in the way that rooms go quiet when something honest and unexpected lands in them. Evelyn looked at him from across the table. He didn't look back, but the tips of his ears went red, which was all the acknowledgement either of them needed. The seasons that followed had the ordinary shape of a working ranch, hard in the ways that were predictable and surprising in the ways that weren't. The spring planting went in late because of a second frost that nobody had expected, and the back section of the south pasture flooded when the creek ran higher than anyone had seen it in 8 years. There was a summer where the cattle prices dropped enough to make everyone nervous, and a fall where 2 of the horses needed veterinary care in the same week, and the timing was bad. Life on the land is like that. It doesn't modulate itself toward convenience. But the ranch held, more than held. It changed in ways that were slow enough to be easy to miss unless you were paying attention. Evelyn's kitchen garden came back over 2 seasons into something genuinely productive. The tall tomatoes staked in the back row exactly where Elias had said they belonged. The fence lines that had been struggling when she'd arrived were now maintained with the consistency of people who understood that small problems addressed early are not the same as small problems left alone. Henry's bookkeeping improved to the point where, by his 16th year, he was running the ranch's accounts with a precision that Evelyn could audit in 20 minutes and find nothing wrong with. The boys grew. That was the thing that moved through her in ways she hadn't prepared for, watching them grow, not just in the physical way, but in the way that matters more. Elias took on a section of the north grazing land and managed it as his own operation within the ranch, making decisions that were sometimes wrong and learning from the wrongness in the way that people only learn when the consequences are real. Caleb's anger, which had been the defining fact of him when she'd arrived, became something else over time. Not gone, because people don't lose what's core to them, but redirected, refined, turned into a stubbornness about doing things right that made him one of the most reliable workers on the property, and she thought would serve him well in whatever life he built when he eventually built one outside of this valley. Daniel stopped breaking things. Not all at once, and not without setbacks. There was an incident involving a fence post and what appeared to be genuine malice toward it that set them back about 6 months, but over time the furnace in him found different fuel. He had a talent with horses that nobody had noticed while he was busy being angry, a particular patience and steadiness with difficult animals that surprised everyone, including Daniel. By the time he was 14, Silas was letting him handle the young horses entirely, which was not a small thing. Seth talked. That was maybe the simplest way to put it. The boy who had moved through his grief in careful, guarded silence slowly became someone who said what he was thinking, not always at the right moment and not always with the right words, but said it. He had his mother's humor, people said, people who had known the family before. It surfaced gradually, like something that had been there all along, waiting for the room to be safe enough. Tommy grew up. That was the hardest to watch and the most natural, and the most both at once. He was no longer the round-faced 8-year-old who had pressed his finger into her biscuit dough and told her things about his family that no one else would have told her. He was a boy becoming a young man, which meant he was sometimes difficult and sometimes tender and often somewhere between. And he had Evelyn's habit of noticing things, which she discovered one day when he described a problem with the irrigation ditch in terms so precise and observational that she stopped what she was doing and looked at him with an expression she couldn't control. "What?" he said. "Nothing," she said. You see things clearly." He shrugged in the teenage approximation of dismissal, but she saw him file it away, the way people file away the things that matter. She had not replaced their mother. She had never tried to, and the fact that she'd been careful about that from the beginning was something she still believed had been right, because you cannot replace a person, and attempts to do so are a kind of dishonesty that children, especially, can feel even when they can't name it. What she had done, what she had been, as closely as she could manage, was a different thing. Someone who showed up consistently. Someone who paid attention to who they actually were instead of who she needed them to be. Someone who stayed. Staying, she had come to understand, was not the passive thing it sounded like. It was a daily decision, especially in the months when the decision was hard, when the winter was long or the money was short, or the grief that lived permanently in the house flared up and made everyone sharp-edged and difficult. She had stayed through those months too. And the staying had accumulated into something she couldn't have described at the beginning, but could see clearly now, looking back. A trust so deep it had become invisible, the way the floor is invisible because you never think about whether it will hold you. The creek ran through the south pasture the same way it had always run, indifferent to the human arrangements on its banks. On summer evenings, Evelyn sometimes walked down to it alone, after supper, and stood where the water moved fast over the flat stones, and thought about the woman who had walked up the Ashcroft Drive 3 years ago with worn-through boots and a single silver coin warm from too much holding. She still had the coin. She kept it in a small dish on the windowsill of what had once been a storage room and was now, with the addition of a second window and proper curtaining and a bookshelf that Caleb had built badly and then rebuilt correctly, a room she was genuinely glad to be in. She didn't rub it between her fingers anymore. She didn't need to. One evening in late summer, Silas came and stood beside her at the creek. They'd been married 2 years by then. He was still a man of few words, and she had stopped waiting for that to change because it wasn't going to, and it didn't need to. He stood there beside her with his hands in his pockets and looked at the water. "Pruitt asked me today what I thought the valley would look like in 10 years, he said. "What did you tell him?" "I told him I didn't know, but I thought it would look like something worth passing on." She looked at him. He was looking at the creek. "You think that?" she said. "I do," he said, simply, without ceremony. She looked back at the water. The late light was on it, turning it gold and ordinary and extraordinary at the same time. The way ordinary things are extraordinary when you are present enough to actually see them. She thought about what it had cost to get here. Not just the battle with Langford, the documents, the fire. Those were real costs, and she didn't minimize them. But the other costs, the ones that don't get recorded, the cost of walking into a stranger's yard and asking for a corner to sleep in. The cost of staying when leaving would have been easier. The cost of letting herself be needed and then letting herself need, which was the harder thing by far, the thing she'd spent 2 years of her life before this avoiding. She thought about a woman who had walked away from a grief so heavy it had become indistinguishable from who she was. walked away with nothing but a coin and a coat too big at the shoulders, and had ended up here, at this creek, on this land, with this man beside her and 6 boys somewhere behind them in a house that smelled of supper and wood smoke and the specific, unrepeatable accumulation of years of people living honestly in the same space. None of it had been inevitable. That was the thing. At every point it could have gone differently. If Silas had been a harder man, or a lesser one. If she had let Caleb's anger push her out the door. If she'd been too proud to read those ledgers, or too careful to go back into a burning shed. If she'd kept her weight on her back foot, and her bag packed, and her heart at a careful distance. It wasn't that she'd made all the right choices. She hadn't. She'd made the choices she could make with what she had, and some of them had been clumsy and some of them had been wrong, and 1 or 2 of them had been better than she'd known she was capable of, and the accumulation of all of them had brought her to this particular evening beside this particular creek. She reached into her coat pocket and found the silver coin by feel, smooth on one face, worn from years of being held through hard things. She looked at it for a moment, then she put it back. Some things you keep not because you need them anymore, but because of what they remind you you've survived. The creek ran on. Behind them, up at the house, she could hear Tommy's voice carrying over the evening air, laughing at something. That full, uncomplicated laugh of a boy who has remembered that laughter is available to him. And Silas turned his head toward the sound the way parents turn toward their children's voices. Automatic and permanent and complete. She turned too. They walked back up to the house together, through the late summer grass, toward the light in the windows and the sound of the family inside it. And the door opened before they reached it. Daniel, coming out for some reason he'd already forgotten, holding it wide without thinking, light spilling out around him into the evening. "Supper's getting cold," he said. "We're coming," Silas said. They went inside.